The 1970s were a time of revolution, music, and unforgettable television. For most of us, these stars were like family members. We invited them into our living rooms every night through our TV screens. They were the symbols of success, beauty, and happiness. But what we didn't see was the shadow world behind the camera. In an era where mental health was rarely discussed and partying was a professional requirement, many of our favourite icons fell into a trap. They used substances to cope with the fame, the pressure, and the loneliness. Today we count down the 10 most beloved stars of the 70s who fought losing battles with their hidden demons. Number 1. Richard Burton. Richard Burton was the ultimate heavyweight of the 1970s. With a voice that sounded like velvet and thunder, he was the miner's son who conquered Hollywood. But beneath the Shakespearean dignity was a man being eaten alive by alcohol. To the world, Burton was the definition of grandeur. His legendary marriage to Elizabeth Taylor, the diamonds, the private jets, it was the stuff of fairy tales. He was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and was considered the greatest actor of his generation. He was the man every man wanted to be. The truth was that Burton was a functioning alcoholic for years. But by the mid-70s he stopped functioning. At his worst, he was drinking 3 bottles of vodka a day. During the filming of his 1974 movie The Klansman, he was so drunk that he had to be held up by crew members just to stay in the frame. His addiction wasn't just a habit, it was a physical dependency that changed his DNA. He suffered from excruciating back pain and used alcohol to numb it, which only created a vicious cycle. He famously remarked that he could hardly remember the entire decade of the 70s. When he died suddenly in 1984 at age 58, his body was that of a much older man. The Prince of Players had been hollowed out by the bottle. Number 2, Oliver Reed. If Richard Burton was the intellectual drunk, Oliver Reed was the warrior drunk. He was the star of The Three Musketeers and Gladiator later in life, but the 70s were his prime years of chaos. The public loved Ollie. He was a regular on talk shows like Aspel and Company, where he would often show up intoxicated, perform a drunk dance, or insult the host. People thought it was a bit, a character he was playing for laughs. He was the lovable rogue of British cinema. In reality, Reed was a man in deep pain. His alcoholism was a violent, self-destructive force. He would engage in legendary drinking bouts, sometimes consuming over 100 pints of beer in a single weekend. By the late 70s, his addiction had made him uninsurable for big Hollywood movies. Directors were afraid he would burn down the set or start a fight with the lead actor. His face became bloated, and his once sharp acting skills were buried under layers of gin and tonic. He wasn't just having a laugh. He was a man who felt he had to live up to the tough guy image the public demanded, even if it meant drinking himself into an early grave. He eventually died in a bar in Malta after a final massive drinking competition. Number 3. Keith Moon. Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who, was the heartbeat of 70s rock and roll. But that heartbeat was being pushed to the limit by a dangerous cocktail of drugs and booze. Known as Moon the Loon, he was the funniest man in rock. He was famous for blowing up toilets with dynamite and driving luxury cars into hotel swimming pools. He was the life of the party, the man who brought pure energy to every stage he touched. Behind the jokes, Keith Moon was terrified of silence. He couldn't be alone. To stay up, he used massive amounts of cocaine and amphetamines. To come down, he drank bottles of brandy and took horse tranquilizers. By 1975, his performances were suffering. He would often pass out behind his drum kit in front of thousands of fans. His bandmates tried to help him, but the 70s rock star culture only encouraged his madness. He was trapped in a cycle of needing to be the crazy Keith Moon 24 hours a day. Tragically, in 1978, he overdosed on pills that were actually prescribed to help him quit drinking. He was only 32 years old, but he had lived 1,000 lives of pain in that short time. Number 4. Diana Dors. In the 1970s, Diana Dors was a national treasure. Often marketed as Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe, she had evolved from a young starlet into a seasoned, witty, and deeply loved television personality. But as the decade progressed, the glamorous Dors persona became a heavy mask to wear. To the average viewer, Diana was the ultimate survivor. She was seen as a woman who had conquered Hollywood and returned to the UK to reign over chat shows and sitcoms. She was always dressed in sequins, with perfectly coiffed platinum hair and a sharp, key self-deprecating sense of humour. The public saw a woman who was comfortable in her skin and enjoying the fruits of a long career. Behind the scenes, the bombshell was struggling with a devastating reliance on prescription medication and alcohol. The 1970s were a period of immense personal stress for Diana. She was facing mounting financial pressures due to the disappearance of a secret fortune hidden by her late husband, and she was terrified of aging in an industry that obsessed over youth. To cope with the anxiety and the grueling schedule of cabaret performances, Diana began to self-medicate. It started with slimming pills, amphetamines, to maintain her figure and progressed into a heavy dependence on barbiturates to sleep. Some friends noted that her legendary party girl image was being fueled by spirits to numb the physical pain of her secret health battles. By the late 70s, her body was under immense strain. While she never lost her professional spark, the demons of addiction were quietly hollowing her out. She was a woman providing light to millions while standing in a very dark corner herself. Number 5. Tony Hancock. If there was one face that defined British comedy in the 60s and early 70s, it was Tony Hancock. He was a pioneer of the sitcom, and his Hancock's Half Hour was a cultural phenomenon. But Hancock is perhaps the most famous example of the sad clown trope, a man whose humour was a byproduct of his inner turmoil. Hancock was the lad himself. He played a lovable, pompous, but ultimately relatable loser from East Cheam. The audience felt they knew him. He was the everyman who struggled with the frustrations of modern life. When he was on screen, the streets of Britain were literally empty because everyone was inside watching him. He was a symbol of comedic perfection. In reality, Hancock was a chronic alcoholic who suffered from a paralysing lack of self-confidence. Despite his massive success, he was convinced he was a fraud. He began to believe that his writers and co-stars were the reason for his success, so he fired them all, hoping to prove his solo genius. This isolation drove him deeper into a vodka bottle. By the early 1970s, even though his peak had passed, the addiction had taken full control. His functioning years were over. He would turn up to recordings unable to remember his lines, his hands shaking so violently that he had to hide them in his pockets. He travelled to Australia in a desperate attempt to reboot his career, but the demons followed him. He was found dead in a hotel room, surrounded by empty bottles and a note that read, "Things just seem to go wrong too many times. The man who made a nation laugh died in the most heartbreaking silence imaginable." Number 6. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a chameleon. Whether he was playing the bumbling Inspector Clouseau in The Pink Panther, or 3 different roles in Dr. Strangelove, he was a genius of transformation. But by the 1970s, the man behind the characters had become a ghost, lost in a fog of drugs and erratic behaviour. Sellers was the world's favourite funny man. He was the eccentric genius, the man of 1,000 voices and a global superstar. He was often seen driving fast cars, dating the world's most beautiful women, and living a life of high-end luxury. To the public, he was the definition of cool and unpredictable. The truth was that Peter Sellers was a polydrug addict whose personality was severely altered by his substance abuse. He was a frequent user of amyl nitrites, poppers, and cocaine, which he used to manage his deep-seated insecurities and legendary mood swings. Sellers famously admitted, "I have no personality of my own. I have to look in the mirror to see who I am today." His addiction made him a nightmare on set. In the 70s, his behaviour became increasingly paranoid and occasionally violent. He would fire assistants for wearing the colour purple or for making the wrong sound during a take. He suffered a series of near-fatal heart attacks, partly fueled by the stimulants he took to keep his energy up. His reliance on drugs wasn't just about partying. It was a desperate attempt to fill the void of a man who felt he didn't actually exist when the cameras weren't rolling. The world saw a comedic god. His family and crew saw a man spiralling into a chemical abyss. Number 7. Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr was an explosion of energy. In the 1970s, he was one of the highest paid and most sought-after comedians in Britain. His unpredictable, high-octane performances made him a television staple. To the British public, Freddie was the wild card. He was the man who would suddenly jump on a table, mimic an Elvis song, or throw himself into the audience. He was chaotic, hilarious, and seemingly possessed by an endless supply of natural adrenaline. He was the star of the Freddie Star Show and a regular guest on every major variety program. If Freddie was on the bill, you knew you were in for a wild ride. However, that manic energy wasn't always natural. Behind the scenes, Freddie Starr was battling a severe addiction to prescription drugs, specifically Valium and other tranquilizers, which he used to come down from the high of performing. As the 70s progressed, he also became heavily involved in the heavy drinking culture of the cabaret circuit. His unpredictability on screen began to turn into genuine instability in private. The demons of his addiction made him notoriously difficult to work with. He would oscillate between extreme generosity and terrifying rages. The pills he took to calm his nerves eventually began to dull his comedic timing. While the public laughed at his antics, his inner circle watched a man slowly losing his grip on reality, fueled by a chemical cocktail that promised peace, but delivered only paranoia. Number 8. David Bowie. While Bowie is a global legend, the mid to late 1970s was a period where his creative genius was almost extinguished by a terrifyingly focused addiction. This was the era of Young Americans and Station to Station. Bowie was the chameleon of rock. In the 70s, he moved from Ziggy Stardust to the Thin White Duke. He looked like an alien aristocrat, elegant, pale, and incredibly cool. He was the cutting edge of fashion and music. To the fans, his gaunt appearance was just another artistic look, a stylistic choice for his new persona. The reality was far more dangerous. Bowie later admitted that during the mid-70s he was living on a diet of red peppers, milk and cocaine. His addiction was so severe that he later claimed he had absolutely no memory of recording the album Station to Station. He was living in a state of psychological terror, trapped in a world of occultism and paranoia. He believed that witches were trying to steal his blood and that UFOs were watching him from the skies of Los Angeles. The Thin White Duke wasn't just a character. It was the physical manifestation of a man whose body was being wasted away by high-grade cocaine. It wasn't until he fled to Berlin in 1976 that he managed to escape the demon that nearly claimed his life. He survived, but many of his peers from that 70s drug culture did not. Number 9. Sid James. Sid James was the face of the Carry On films and the star of the hit sitcom Bless This House. With his craggy face and iconic dirty laugh, he was perhaps the most recognizable man in Britain. Sid was everyone's naughty uncle. He was the lovable rogue who was always chasing women or trying to win a quick buck at the races. He represented a certain type of British masculinity, rough around the edges but ultimately harmless and funny. He was the ultimate pro, never missing a cue and always delivering the laugh. But Sid James had two major addictions that ruled his life: gambling and alcohol. In the 1970s, despite being a top earner, he was often flat broke because he would bet thousands of pounds on horses in a single afternoon. To cope with the stress of his debts and a failing marriage, he turned to the bottle. He was a heavy drinker who hid his consumption under the guise of being a social man. On the set of Bless This House, he was often seen with a glass of water that was actually neat gin. The pressure to maintain his jolly persona while his personal life was collapsing under the weight of debt and whiskey eventually took its toll. In 1976, while performing on stage at the Sunderland Empire, Sid suffered a massive heart attack and died. The audience, thinking it was part of the act, continued to laugh as he collapsed. The demon had finally caught up with him, and the laughter died with him. Number 10. Judy Garland. While Judy Garland is often associated with the golden age of Hollywood, her final, most tragic years were spent in London during the late 60s and the dawn of the 70s. She is the ultimate symbol of what happens when the industry consumes a human soul. To the world, she was Dorothy. She was the girl who followed the yellow brick road, the voice that sang over the rainbow. Even in her later years, she was a powerhouse of emotion. When she performed at the Talk of the Town in London, the audiences were packed with people desperate to see a legend. They saw a fragile but brilliant woman who poured every ounce of her heart into every note. The reality was a pharmacopoeia of tragedy. Judy's addiction didn't start in the 70s. It was forced upon her as a child star by studios that gave her pep pills to work and sleeping pills to rest. By the time she reached the end of her life in London, she was a shadow of herself. She was often unable to perform, was slurring her words on stage as audiences, the same people who claimed to love her, pelted her with bread rolls and glasses. She was broke, lonely, and deeply addicted to barbiturates. Her hidden demon wasn't a secret. It was a public execution. In June 1969, just as the decade was turning, she was found dead in her Chelsea Mews house from an incidental overdose. Her story cast a long, dark shadow over the 1970s, serving as a grim warning of how fame and chemistry can be a lethal combination. Why was the 1970s such a graveyard for talent? To understand the hidden demons, we have to understand the world these stars lived in. In the 70s, drugs and heavy drinking weren't just common, they were professional requirements. If you were a rock star, you were expected to use cocaine. If you were a comedian, you were expected to be at the bar until 4 a.m. There was no rehab culture as we know it today. There was no wellness or mental health awareness. If a star was struggling, the industry's solution was usually to give them more pills so they could finish the movie or the show. The 70s saw the birth of modern paparazzi culture. Stars were hunted. Their addictions weren't seen as illnesses to be treated, but as scandals to be sold for 10 pence at a newsstand. As we look back at the 10 names on this list, Richard Burton, Oliver Reed, Keith Moon, Diana Dawes, Tony Hancock, Peter Sellers, Freddie Starr, David Bowie, Sid James, and Judy Garland, we see a pattern of brilliance overshadowed by pain. These weren't bad people. They were men and women of extraordinary talent who were caught in a storm they weren't prepared for. Some, like David Bowie, managed to find the shore and rebuild their lives. Others were pulled under the waves, leaving behind only the flickering images of their performances and the echoes of their laughter. Today, we talk about these stories not to judge them, but to remember the human being behind the icon. We watch their films and listen to their music, but we must also acknowledge the cost of that entertainment. The 1970s was a decade of neon and glitter, but for those who lived it under the spotlight, the hidden demons were always just one drink or one pill away. The next time you see a clip of Sid James laughing or Keith Moon smashing his drums, remember that there was a person there, a person who was often crying out for help while the world was cheering for more. The 70s gave us some of the greatest art of the 20th century, but it also took some of our brightest lights far too soon. Their stories are a testament to the fragility of fame and the enduring power of the human spirit, even when it's battling its darkest shadows. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the hidden lives of the 70s icons. Which of these stars did you grow up watching, and which story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more untold stories from the golden age of entertainment.